Hello, welcome to the Grow Your Wealthy Mindset podcast, where it is all about helping amazing physicians just like you create a wealthy life free from burnout and with the financial security to practice medicine on your own terms. I'm your host, Dr. Elisa Zhang. Welcome back to another episode of the Grow Your Wealthy Mindset podcast. Today, the subject is the 4% rule. You may have heard that 4% is the safe rate of withdrawal from your retirement portfolio. But do you really know where that number comes from or what it truly represents? Maybe you've heard of the Trinity Study, but what were the actual findings from the study and what does that mean for the 4% rule today? That's what we're going to dig into in today's episode. The 4% rule has long been used as a rule of thumb for figuring out how much of your nest egg you need in order to retire. Nowadays, the 4% rule has become even more encompassing in how it's used, aside from the original results of the Trinity Study. It's also been used as a rule of thumb on how to figure out how much of a nest egg you need in order to retire by essentially working backwards. If you can safely withdraw 4% of the value of your stock and bond portfolio when you're in retirement and not run out of money, then you can use that to figure out, well, how much of a portfolio do you need if you want to withdraw a certain amount of money while you're in retirement? You may have heard that to figure out how much money you need to retire, you should multiply your annual spending by 25. This is essentially a variation on the 4% rule that comes from the equation annual amount that can be withdrawn for a portfolio equals portfolio value multiplied by 4% or 0.04. To turn the equation around to solve for what the portfolio value should be, you would divide both halves of the equation by 4% or 0.04. So now you have portfolio value equals annual spending per year divided by 0.04, which is actually the same as multiplying by 25. I hope that makes sense. This is something where sometimes seeing it is easier than hearing it. But basically, if you're wanting to solve for how much portfolio do you need in order for you to have a certain amount of spending each year, and you can withdraw 4% from the portfolio, now you're just dividing your spending by the 4% you're multiplying the portfolio value at, which is the same as multiplying by 25. In doing this, you're making the assumption that the amount of annual spending you'll need for your entire retirement is the same as your current annual spending habits. In last week's episode, I presented some evidence that people spend less as they age, which would imply that people don't need as much as they spend during their working years as they do in their later years of retirement. Check out episode 118, Retirement is Not an Endless Vacation, to get the details. This week, we're going to really look at what is a safe withdrawal rate. The withdrawal rate is a percentage of a retirement portfolio that an investor withdraws annually to pay for living expenses. The challenge is to determine what rate can be withdrawn without depleting the portfolio before the death of the investor. Retirement can last 30 years or even more when you're retiring at age 65. If you are thinking about retiring at a younger age, then that portfolio would potentially need to last even longer. Withdrawing too much could deplete the savings too early. But on the other hand, if you withdraw less than you actually could, then you may be hindering your lifestyle. And this also can lead to young retirees not taking full advantage of the time where they still have energy and health to use the money to their greatest advantage. By settling on a lower withdrawal rate than necessary, it can also lead to people working longer than they actually need to or even want to in order to build a larger retirement portfolio. I love looking at the original studies and seeing what the studies actually found instead of what gets summarized and sometimes even mutated into what becomes commonly held belief that may or may not actually be a good deduction or that follows the original conclusion of the study. Usually, the conclusion gets applied to more situations than was originally tested, or certain assumptions are forgotten. So let's dive deeper into the literature to see what it really tells us and if the 4% rule is still a good rule of thumb to follow. The actual name of the article that's been nicknamed the Trinity Study is Retirement Savings, Choosing a Withdrawal Rate that is Sustainable. It was written by 3 authors, Philip Cooley, Carl Hubbard, and Daniel Walls, who are all professors of finance in the Department of Business Administration at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. That's where the name of the Trinity Study came from, the university where all the authors worked. It was published in the February 1998 issue of AII. They based their work on the work of William Bengen, who published in October 1994 in the Journal of Financial Planning an article entitled Determining Withdrawal Rates Using Historical Data. This has later been called the SafeMax study. William Bengen was a certified financial planner in California who specialized in investment management at the time he published the article. I'm going to talk more about the Trinity study in a little bit, but first let's actually look more at the paper that Mr. Bengen published. In that paper, Bengen starts by writing about a fictional scenario where in 2004, 20 years in the future, he's helped his clients have a nice, healthy retirement portfolio and they're ready to retire. Then the market plummets 35% in the next 2 years, but recovers 3 years later. However, inflation averaged 8% over those last 5 years, from 2004 to 2009, which eroded purchasing power. Now, in the year 2009, those retirement portfolios that looked great in 2004 will either run out early or cause the retirees to drastically reduce their quality of life. What Bengen is describing is a sequence of returns risks. The risk that the stock market or whatever investments a retirement portfolio is invested in does really poorly in the early retirement years. He then went on to demonstrate that planning to withdraw the average returns of a portfolio could lead to depleting a portfolio. In his study, Bengen used the historical performance of investments and inflation as presented in Ibbotson Associates' Stocks, Bonds, Bills, and Inflation, 1992 yearbook. From that data, the following assumptions were made. Common stocks returned 10.3%, intermediate term treasuries returned 5.1%, and inflation averaged 3%. Taking those numbers, a portfolio consisting of 60% stocks and 40% bonds would be expected to have an average compounded return of 8.2%, assuming continual rebalancing. The real return, adjusted for inflation, would be almost 5.1%. Would it be possible to withdraw 5.1% a year to allow a retiree to maintain a consistent lifestyle throughout their retirement and not deplete their entire portfolio? This is the question that Bengen first sought out to answer. Bengen then ran a portfolio invested in 50% stocks and 50% bonds through the historical data. He states he picked a 50-50 mix as an arbitrary asset allocation, which does seem a little inconsistent with the 60-40 mix that came up with the average 5% real rate of return, but we'll look past that for the time being. He doesn't really state exactly what the value of the portfolio he used, but it's really all relative, so it doesn't really matter. For the purposes of illustration, I think it is easier to talk in numbers. Let's say there's an initial portfolio of $1 million US. If the initial withdrawal rate is 5%, that would mean taking out $50,000 in the first year to live on. In every subsequent year, the amount would be what was taken out the prior year. In this case, the first year was $50,000, and then adjust that amount by inflation. If inflation is 3%, then the next year, you would withdraw $51,500 from the retirement portfolio, which is 3% above $50,000. Every year after that, you would continue to adjust for the amount of the rate of inflation and withdraw from the portfolio accordingly. Bengen then simulated the portfolio for every year in the past, going through rolling periods of years, using the rate of return for stocks, bonds, and inflation to see if and when the portfolio would be depleted to zero. What I mean by he ran it for a rolling 30 years is that he would run the portfolio through 1930 to 1960, and then run that same portfolio starting in 1931 to 1961, then again from 1932 to 1962, and so on. What he found was that if a person retired before the 1973 to 74 recession, or the 1937 to 1941 recession, or during the early years of the Great Depression, then the portfolio would not last 30 years. Bengen shows that the results of a 5% initial withdrawal rate, followed by adjusting in subsequent years for inflation, that for people beginning their retirement in the late 1960s and early 1970s, that their portfolio invested in 50% stocks and 50% bonds may only end up lasting about 20 years before they run out of money. When he ran the same scenarios with the withdrawal rate of 3%, then he found really different results. In this case, the retirement portfolio lasted for over 50 years for all cases tested, meaning every rolling period of 50 years he tested, the portfolio would actually last with a 3% withdrawal rate. This was true for withdrawal rates as high as approximately 3.5%, according to his paper. Bengen then concluded that a 4% first-year withdrawal rate, followed by inflation-adjusted withdrawals in subsequent years, should be safe. In no past case would the portfolio be depleted before 33 years, and in most cases, it leads to a portfolio lasting for 50 years or longer. The initial portfolio he tested was one that was 50% stocks and 50% bonds. He then goes on to test 5 different asset allocations, consisting of 100% stocks, 75% stocks, 25% bonds, a 50-50 mix of stocks and bonds, 25% stocks and 75% bonds, and 100% bonds. He tested different withdrawal rates ranging from 1 to 8%. Every portfolio, no matter the asset allocation, failed to last for more than 20 years given a 5% withdrawal rate or higher. On the flip side, every portfolio, even the one invested in 100% bonds, lasted for more than 50 years with the 1% withdrawal rate. Any portfolio with at least 25% in stocks lasted over 50 years at a 2% withdrawal rate. And any portfolio with at least 50% stocks lasted over 50 years at the 3% withdrawal rate. The most variability was found at the 4% withdrawal rate. Bengen did a closer look at the role of asset allocation and found that a 75% stock and 25% bond portfolio proved to be better than a 50-50 asset allocation. A 100% stock portfolio did not generally have significant advantages over the 75% stock and 25% bond portfolio, but did have serious downsides. The conclusion that he writes in his paper is actually quite nuanced. He recommends determining a safe withdrawal rate by computing the shortest portfolio life acceptable to the client, generally the client's life expectancy plus an additional 5 to 10 years. Then to use the charts for a 50-50 stock bond allocation, then determine the highest withdrawal rate that satisfies the desired minimum portfolio life. For clients aged 60 to 65, this will generally be about 4%. The withdrawal dollar amount for the first year is then adjusted up or down for inflation every succeeding year, and the withdrawal rate is no longer used for computing the amount withdrawn after the first year. His recommendations don't directly determine what portfolio size to recommend when a client can retire, as it will depend on a client's age and life expectancy. However, if you want to apply this to you, you can use different retirement calculators to figure out an approach for your personal situation. We began this podcast episode by talking about the Trinity Study, so let's go more into the details of that study. Keep in mind that the study was published in 1998, so it has less market data than is available currently. The authors tested withdrawal rates ranging from 3% to 12% with portfolios of 100% stocks, 75% stocks and 25% bonds, 50-50 stocks and bonds, 25% stocks and 75% bonds, and 100% bonds. They used the S&P 500 index to represent stocks and long-term high-grade corporate bonds to represent bonds. Similar to Bengen, they used the publication from Ibbotson Associates, Stocks, Bonds, Bills, and Inflation, 1996 yearbook, in order to get their data. They did not adjust for taxes or transaction costs. They ran each portfolio with each withdrawal rate and examined how each portfolio did after periods of 15 years, 20 years, 25 years, and 30 years, and determined the portfolio success rate. The portfolio success rate in the study is a percentage of all past payout periods where the ending value of the portfolio was above 0, meaning the portfolio did not run out of money. Basically, the Trinity study did the same thing that Bengen did with his paper, with one significant difference and a few minor differences. The first minor difference is that they had a few more years of data, since they published later. Bengen only had data up to 1992. The Trinity authors also tested withdrawal rates up to 12%, whereas Bengen stopped at 8%. Since with withdrawal rates of 6% or higher, portfolios weren't really lasting 30 years or even 20 years, the only real reason to look at higher rates is to look at that 15-year scenario. Another difference is how the authors incorporated inflation. For Bengen, he used the withdrawal rate to determine how much money was taken out of the portfolio the first year. Then each subsequent year, the amount was adjusted for inflation and withdrawn from the portfolio the next year. In the Trinity study, they actually ran it two ways. First, they did their study without adjusting for inflation at all. I will say that I actually worry more about high inflation than poor stock market performance when it comes to my retirement funds lasting. As many of us have felt the effects of inflation these last few years, we realize that we end up spending more over time with inflation, especially over a 30-year time horizon. The Trinity authors did acknowledge the great effect inflation has, and then they did actually run scenarios and then adjusted the amount of money taken from their portfolio each year with the actual historical values of inflation or deflation using the CPI or customer price index, which is similar to what Bengen did with his analysis. So in the end, the Trinity study basically did the analysis both with and without inflation data. They make the point that economists believe that the CPI tends to overstate the increase of actual cost of living by 1 to 1.5%. Along with people spending less during their later years of life, the amount they need from the portfolio may not necessarily increase with the CPI measured rate of inflation. If that's the case, then people who insist on adjusting their future withdrawal rates with the CPI inflation index may actually end up foregoing the use of money early on in return for having more money in the future than is actually really necessary. This is why they justified running the numbers without actually accounting for inflation. The significant difference between the two studies is that while Bengen looked at the minimum number of years that each portfolio would last, up to 50 years, the Trinity authors measured the success rate of each portfolio over different periods of time, thus giving a probability of success. They found that a portfolio consisting of at least 50% stocks had a 95% chance of success for lasting for 30 years and 100% of success for lasting 25 years when adjusting withdrawal with inflation. While the Trinity study gets summarized as 4% being a safe withdrawal rate, the conclusion of the authors is actually more nuanced. In their conclusion, they state an appropriate annual withdrawal rate from a portfolio during the retirement years, quote, depends on the mix of stocks and bonds in the portfolio, the planned payout period, and the retiree's degree of risk aversion and preferences for consumption patterns, end quote. They recommend those who desire a long payout period plan on lower withdrawal rates, and more retirees would benefit from having at least 50% of their portfolio in common stocks. They also point out that accounting for inflation-adjusted withdrawals leads to a significantly decreased withdrawal rate, likely causing a, quote, suboptimal exchange at present compensation for future consumption, end quote. Most portfolios will end up growing larger than their initial value with withdrawal rates of 3 and 4%. Withdrawal rates as high as 8 to 9% may be sustainable for short payout periods of 15 years or less. There's one phrase that you often see in investment literature. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Both Bengen and the Trinity study used historical data, which is essentially past performance. What will the future look like? In the past 100 years, our society has changed leaps and bounds. Technology, healthcare, and even manufacturing have all changed dramatically. Production has grown exponentially. Will this trend continue? It may be that in the future, stock returns are really not as high as they've been for the last 100 years. If that's the case, then the returns may not be as high, and that would potentially mean to not being able to withdraw quite as much and having the portfolio last. On the other hand, there are many more people investing in the stock market now than in many of these historical years. Discount brokerages, which allow the average individual person to invest in the stock market, only became available in the 1970s. People now invest through their 401ks for their own retirement, which only started happening in the 1980s. With the decrease of pensions and the need for people to invest for their own retirement, this could drive more growth of the stock market. At any rate, we can't control the future of the stock or bond market. We can only make decisions given the information we currently have. The key take-home points that I want you to go away with after listening to this podcast episode is that when accounting for inflation, a 4% withdrawal rate gives a likelihood of your retirement portfolio lasting 30 years is 95%. If you want your portfolio to last indefinitely, you can accomplish this by decreasing your withdrawal rate to less than 4%. At a 3% withdrawal rate, your portfolio will last at least 50 years and likely indefinitely using historical data. Even at 3.5%, it will probably also last indefinitely, given the historical data. A secondary take-home point is that it's highly recommended to have at least 50% of your portfolio invested in common stocks. Again, this is just looking at portfolios that consist of stocks and bonds. And in this case, the stocks were really the S&P 500 index, so it didn't include international stocks or small cap stocks or mid cap stocks. I hope this episode has been informative and giving you a better understanding of the 4% rule. If you have questions or don't understand something in today's podcast, please reach out to me. You can email your question to growyourwealthymindset@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Feedback really helps me improve this podcast and how I teach this material. Thanks so much for being a listener of the Grow Your Wealthy Mindset podcast. If you're enjoying this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. It really helps to get the word out. I'll be back next week with another episode. If you enjoyed this episode, I would love it if you could share it with your friends and colleagues. And now for the disclaimer. I am not a certified financial planner, accountant, or attorney, and nothing I say should be construed as professional investment, tax, or legal advice. This show is primarily for your education and entertainment. I am a physician, but I'm probably not your physician. So if you need any medical advice, please contact your own physician. Thank you.